All right. So we'll go ahead and get started. I'll try to, move through fairly quickly so that we can leave a little bit of time at the end for questions. But I'll just say up front that if we, get to the end and we haven't gotten to everybody's questions, the last slide in the PowerPoint is my contact information. And, between now and the deadline for the grant, I'm available if you have any questions as you look through the RFPs, as you start to log in and create an account in the portal, as you start to look through the application. Please do let me know if you have any questions at any point in the process. But we'll just start out by kind of covering the basics. So the DC Oral History Collaborative, it's a program of Humanities DC and the DC Public Library. My organization, the organization that I work with, is Humanities DC. Humanities DC, if you haven't worked with us before, I know many people who are on with us tonight have worked with Humanities DC in the past, but we are the State Humanities Council for Washington, DC. We're one of 56 such institutions across the country, all affiliates of the National Endowment for the Humanities, but we are a non-government agency. We're a nonprofit organization that's affiliated with the National Endowment for the Humanities. And our role is to provide grants and programming around the humanities throughout Washington, DC. And the DC Oral History Collaborative, our partnership with the DC Public Library, is kind of a combination of those things. It is in part a grant, but it is also in part a series of programs and trainings. So yeah, one of the 56 state humanities councils. We're a private nonprofit organization. We do try to, conduct these projects and fund projects across the city. Our funding is for all 8 wards. It's for, communities across the city. The goal is for the funding and the programming that Humanities DC does to be as diverse and as geographically spread across the city as possible. Just a quick definition of the humanities, based in part off of the definition provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities. Of course, for the oral history grant, our focus is going to be primarily on history, but not solely on history. So oral history, and we'll talk a little bit about specifically what we mean when we say oral history, doesn't necessarily have to be solely about the past, because you're interviewing people about their full lives. And in some cases, you'll be interviewing people about recent events. And in some cases, oral historians will interview people about contemporary events. And part of the idea there is that, you're kind of building up this record, you're building up an archival resource of people's memories, people's stories, to complement the written archival record as well. So although, we say oral history and we typically think about history being the key humanities discipline for the project, it can definitely be, or oral history can definitely be interdisciplinary. Just a few more notes about, what our definition of the humanities is as an organization, especially relevant if you're thinking about potentially looking at some of the other grant opportunities that Humanities DC has to offer. And I should say, and hopefully I'll, say it again a couple times before we finish, the DC Oral History Collaborative is, again, only one of the grants that Humanities DC offers, and there will be other grant opportunities that will be released, including grants for documentary films, for public projects and events, kind of more broadly for youth programming. So there are a lot of grant opportunities from Humanities DC. I think if possible, we might kind of forego our video. This slide is for our Tell Your Story video. And I think that in the interest of time and making sure that we leave some time for questions, we won't show the entire video today, but it is it's available, I believe, on our website if you're interested in seeing that. And it's kind of a great call to action for people who are interested in collecting the oral histories of their neighbors, their communities, and their city. So just a little bit about what we mean when we say oral history. This is the definition of oral history from the Oral History Association. It just largely speaks to kind of how oral history is a little bit different from other forms of interviewing that you might be familiar with. And I think that on the next slide, we can kind of talk about, these various forms of interviews like journalistic interviewing, storytelling, sociological or anthropological research. There's a lot of links between these different types of interviewing and what oral history is. but oral history is still distinct in many ways from some of these other forms of interviewing. Again, very related, but distinct in the fact that, when we're doing oral histories, we're typically looking at sitting down with somebody for an extended period of time. Often oral histories are between an hour and a half and 2 hours long per session. And the other thing that's kind of distinctive is that although in oral history, you're often, trying to get to a particular topic or a theme, or there's some kind of aspect of a person's life that you're really interested in capturing, oral historians are often also interested in capturing the full life history of the narrator. So that's another really important thing to consider, even as you're like at this stage and you're thinking about what your project might look like. Because, I know that a lot of times people will have this idea that they want to go out and they want to interview 30 people about this very specific topic. And it's possible to have a project like that, but really if you're thinking about what oral history is from the perspective of, the DC Oral History Collaborative, we're really looking at kind of these long form interviews that really kind of, in a lot of cases, go all the way back to each one of your narrators' childhoods and their kind of early conceptions of things, so that we can kind of see how that person developed over time and how the world that that person lived in developed over time. So, it's definitely something to consider. I think we might get to this a little bit later in the presentation, but there is a minimum for the grant period of 5 oral histories that would be collected. And, really, I know that kind of might seem like a small number of interviews if you're used to some of these other forms of interviewing, but collecting those 5 oral histories can in a lot of ways be a lot of work. So definitely something to consider. Just a few reasons here for why oral history can be really valuable for the type of work that you're doing. Of course, there's the immediate idea that, we want to collect these stories for the future. We want to make sure that people's voices are preserved. We want to make sure that we're building up this archive. And Humanities DC and the DC Oral History Collaborative and all of the great oral historians that we've worked with across the city are building a great archive in the DC Public Library that's now accessible through Dig DC. I'll put a link to that in the chat in just a minute. There are also kind of other more immediate reasons that project directors will start these oral history projects, a lot of times having to do with the research goals that they have in mind. So, if you've already been researching a particular topic, you might find that talking to some people who experienced, the things that you're writing about, that you're finding in the written resources, can fill in some of the gaps, or they can, help you interpret things in a way that you might not have been able to get from what's already in that existing archival written record. Sometimes oral histories, again, because you're looking at the broader life history of an individual, can reveal these gradual societal changes that happen over a lifetime that, again, you might not be able to see in kind of archival resources that kind of pop up at different times throughout the historical narrative. And then a lot of times people will think about doing oral histories kind of prior to kind of larger interpretive projects that they want to do, like films, exhibits, in some cases even performance art. And I think a lot of times the oral history interviews that people collect and they add into these documentary films or exhibits, really kind of add that human perspective, add that authenticity to the message that they're trying to create. So there are a lot of reasons to do oral history. Of course, the big one again is a lot of times people will go back to just that idea that there are these really valuable stories out there from individuals that we don't have with us for that long, and collecting those stories and making them archived and preserved long term is a really important thing to do as soon as possible. So that will just kind of move into the different types of grants that are available through the DC Oral History Collaborative. And when you log into the online grants portal, it'll be really important to make sure that you're clicking on and you're applying for, and you've opened up the application for the correct grant. There are some pretty significant differences here, and you don't want to accidentally start filling out a proposal for the grant program that you don't actually want. So the DCOHC New Projects Grant, that's the one that typically most people are applying for, because that's the grant for the collection of oral history interviews. And the name is a little bit tricky because it doesn't necessarily have to be a new project. It might be, you know, a project that you or your organization have already done for a number of years. You might already have kind of a institutional or personal archive of, you know, a significant number of oral histories already. But the idea is that you're collecting new interviews with the funding that grant provides. So the award is up to $8,000. As I said, you would interview at least 5 narrators over the course of the grant period with that funding. And those interviews would be collected and contributed to the DC Public Library's Dig DC online archive. We also have an extension grant, and that grant is specifically for people who've received the DCOHC New Projects Grant in the past and have successfully closed those grants out. People can request an additional $7,000 to interview another 5 narrators with that extension grant. And then we have the Public Projects and Events Grant. And the key thing to remember about that grant is that it does not cover the collection of new oral histories, but it's specifically for projects that want to take existing oral histories, whether they already exist in a personal archive or they exist in a public archive somewhere. They may even be oral histories that have been collected by other DCOHC grantees and are now in the Dig DC catalog. But it's for projects that take those oral histories out of the archive and are being used to create things like documentary films, exhibits, listening stations, digital humanities projects, any sort of public humanities project that helps the public better engage with those existing archived oral histories. And the idea behind that is, you know, one of the things that we want to do is we want to preserve, but we also want to make sure that the oral histories that are being collected aren't being collected and put into the archive and forgotten about for years. We want to have some mechanism for bringing those oral histories back out of the archive and into the public eye. And the maximum award for those grants is $12,000. The other thing that I'll mention for this year, we have additional funding available for translation of transcripts. So each new project's grantee will be required to collect those oral history interviews, but as part of the grant, the requirement is they also be transcribed and indexed, and each interview will come with a consent form so that those interviews can be submitted to the DC Public Library's archive. But if you're doing your interviews in a language other than English, then you can request additional funds to have those transcripts translated into English. Or if you're, you know, working in a case where, you know, the interviews are being conducted primarily in English, but there's a, you know, need to have those interviews translated into a language other than English so they're more accessible to the community that's providing those interviews, the translation enhancement can also be requested for that purpose as well. And that request is actually part of the application, but it is separate. So you request the translation enhancement as part of the application that you'll fill out for the grant, but whether or not you receive the translation enhancement does not necessarily correlate with whether or not you receive the grant itself. So those are kind of 2 separate processes for selecting those. The deadline for the grant, all of the grants, is January 28th, 2022 at 11:59 p.m. So essentially at midnight on Friday the 28th. And then there's kind of an extended period of panel review of those grant programs. But the notifications would go out in March. The project period would actually start on March 21st, 2022. And then for all 3 grant programs, the grant period is the same. You would have until October 31st, 2022 to complete the work on those grants. All right, and I will pause just a second. I know that that was a lot of information really quickly, and I'll say that we'll probably answer some of the questions in the next few slides, but does anybody have anything that they kind of need a little bit of clarification on right now?
Yeah.
Tony, so you have a question?
Everybody, Jasper, I've got one. So y'all, for context, I've received 2 Humanitides grants from the Humanities DC. And so I already have like life stories of like 20 something people. And I've been thinking about also like another project to like make their interviews or make that data like accessible in some other way. So I'm thinking, I know that this one, for this, but like, could I potentially write for that grant to like extend the project, although it was for a Humanitini?
Yeah, so I think definitely would need a little bit more like information or kind of a reminder of what stories were collected to like provide you with a full answer to that. But just as like an example of a project that was done with a public projects and events grant that was more about providing access. We funded a grant, I think it was in 2020, for the public projects and events, where a DC historian named Brian Kraft, that some people here might know, he kind of did a little bit of research. He took some of the information that DCOHC created through some of its initial surveys, and he actually created a online map of the existing oral histories that are available through digital catalogs in DC. And like, they're all kind of like very, I would say, intelligently or kind of efficiently arrayed on this map, so that like if people are researching a neighborhood or particular community in DC, they can see what oral histories have already been done there. And I usually make it a point to put the link to that map, which is publicly available, out there for, people who are on these info sessions. So I will remember to do that. But long answer to your question, Tony, like, yes, if you have an existing collection of life histories, especially if they're recorded life histories, even if they're like transcribed life histories, a project that makes that archive of material more publicly accessible is something that could be covered by a public projects and events grant.
That answers my question. Thank you very much, Jasper. Also makes my work seem less stressful. Okay, great.
Great. All right, so we'll kind of start out by talking a little bit, try to talk about the new project. Oh, I'm sorry, we have a couple people with raised hands here on the see if looks like Keith and Mauricio. Keith, you want to go first?
Yeah, my question is, if you've already done a grant and it was successful, and you're doing another grant, it's kind of still the same topic. Are we able to change the title of the grant for the extension? Like, for example, we were pre-home rule, now we want to go to post-home rule.
Absolutely, you can definitely change the title on that. I think that as you go through the application, one of the things that we'll ask is like for the prior grant number that you had, and there's a lot of questions included in that extension grant application that kind of, will talk about like that transition, right? So there will be the opportunity to, I think, explain kind of like why the name change exists, like why you're going in that direction, how it builds off the original collection. So yeah, changing the name is, perfectly fine. I think other extension grantees have done that as well.
Thank you.
Sure. Mauricio?
Yes, hi. My question is, so my ultimate goal, the tangible thing that I want to create at the end is a documentary film. My question is, can you apply for this grant to collect new stories or new oral histories, and then use those and apply for the special events grant kind of simultaneously, or do things have to be separated?
That's a good question. And yeah, the way we kind of have things set up right now is that those would be done in 2 separate grant periods, but it's absolutely the way that we kind of like envision things taking place over the long term. One of the things that we have kind of hoped happen, I think we have seen happen in some cases, that people will apply for the new projects grant, they'll extend their grant in a subsequent grant period, and then once they have an archive built up, they'll apply for that public projects and events grant to really put it all together in some sort of really great interpretive piece. So it is possible to apply for more than one, you just have to do it in separate grant periods.
Okay, great.
Sure. Lynn, you have a question?
On the website, it wasn't clear if you have to be a 501c3, or it looked like you could be individuals and a 501c3, but then it wasn't clear.
That's a good question. Yeah, I mean, perfect thing for us to clarify in the info session. It is a little bit complicated. So you can apply for this grant as an individual. So if you're an individual who has a permanent home address in Washington, DC, and you kind of fit all the other eligibility requirements that are listed in that RFP, you can apply for this grant as an individual. If you want to apply as an organization or from your organization, that organization does have to be a 501c3 nonprofit, again, with a physical address that's based in Washington, D.C. If you're representing an organization that's not a 501c3 organization based in DC, you can still apply through a fiscal sponsor if that fiscal sponsor is a 501c3 that's based in Washington, DC. So there are a few different ways there to apply, and it's definitely something that, like I know it's a little bit confusing when you're looking at it on the website, and I can admit that it can be a little bit confusing once you get into the application portal and you start trying to fill out, the information, either for an individual or for an organizational applicant. And that's definitely something that, like, if you get to that point in the application portal, if anybody kind of reaches that point and they have some questions about what they should be putting where, those are things that we can talk through. You can feel free to, again, email or call me and we can work through that. But again, another very long-winded answer. I hope that got to what you were asking there, Lynn.
That's good. We just had to hear it from the horse's mouth. That's it.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. And see, I don't think I see any more raised hands, so we'll go ahead and talk a little bit. We'll try to go through the new projects and the extension grants at the same time, very similar. And, of course, if you're applying for an extension grant, then you've kind of been through this process before. So, again, the new projects grant and the extension grant, both of those grants by the end of the project period are going to result in a collection of interviews that will be submitted to the DC Public Library's Dig DC archive. A minimum of 5 narrators interviewed. The kind of 3 things that we have here, kind of 3 things that you'll see as you kind of get into the application. They're kind of some of the key questions on the narrative that we asked. The first one being, defining a research question, a clear theme or topic around which the interviews will be collected. I mean, it actually sounds like, just kind of listening to all of you talk a little bit about the projects that you're thinking of, that, many of you do already have that research question or that clear theme thought through. But that's just something that, again, I think that, it's important to make sure that you're articulating that clearly in the application. It's something that, again, for a lot of these narrative questions, it makes sense to have somebody else read, just to make sure that it's kind of clear for them as well. One of the things that the reviewers will be looking for is that, defined theme for the, oral histories are going to be collected. I guess, one thing that can kind of help clarify that a little bit is that, a lot of times when people want to do oral history projects, they just think of it as, trying to collect interviews from people who are, getting up there in age, and they want to make sure that they have the stories collected, which is a really great impulse. But then you also have to think about kind of what ties those oral histories together, what the context for all of those oral histories is. And that's what the reviewers are going to be looking for in that first question. The next thing to consider is why oral history is the best tool or approach for that particular research question. A lot of times it might be because you've done a little work looking in the existing written archives. You've looked in, DCPL, or you've looked in manuscript or newspaper archives, and there's just not a lot of information there. So oral history might be kind of the only way you can get to some of these answers that you're looking for. It may be that, a lot of the kind of like culture that you're looking to explore, you're looking to explain, or you're looking to collect some stories with, doesn't have a big imprint in the written archives or in the kind of written narrative. And oral history, again, is kind of like the entree or the way to kind of get in and collect some of those stories or preserve some of that history. And then the other thing you want to think about is articulating the project's contribution to Washington, D.C. history. All of the projects that are funded through the DCOHC grants should focus very specifically on Washington, D.C. topics and themes, but that does not mean that all of your narrators have to be in D.C. or from D.C. It's just that the stories or the topics that they're talking about have to be very D.C. specific topics. Some other narrative requirements, you'll be asked to demonstrate community collaboration and engagement. And this means that you'll be asked to kind of identify how the community that you are working with to collect the oral histories is going to be an active participant in the project. one of the key ways would be, you know, how are you going to recruit narrators for the project? But ideally, in the best case scenarios, what we're looking for here is some indication that you as an oral historian or researcher is not going into a community and extracting stories without involving that community in the process of doing this oral history project. And so this is an opportunity to kind of articulate how, you know, you are kind of building rapport and trust within that community that you're working with. Again, interviewing at least 5 narrators over the course of the project. You'll be asked to estimate how many interviews you're going to collect. You'll be asked to describe the timeline over the course between March and October, how the project will unfold. I know that many of you probably have seen this already in the RFP or might already be aware of this. And I believe that we're going to get to it eventually, but there is a upfront requirement for everybody who receives the new projects grant. Everybody who's already received the grant and is looking at the extension grant is already aware of this, but if you receive the new projects grant, you're required, your project director and possibly even some of your team members, if they can, are required to attend a 3-session oral history workshop. Part of the reason that we do that is just to make sure that everybody kind of has some time to get together as a cohort and to benefit from one another's shared experiences, shared knowledge. But we also do that to make sure that this grant is accessible to anybody, no matter, you know, like what your previous skill level with oral history is, no matter if you've never collected an interview in your life, or if you know, are a long-time academic or journalist, and journalism, or interviewing has been, you know, a big part of your career. We want everybody to have the opportunity to, you know, do this work and to do it really well. So there is that very in-depth 3-session training that is facilitated by a experienced oral historian. And, you know, one of the things that we ask about related to that training in the application is what you would want to get out of that training and what you could potentially bring to that training as well. And that could be, you know, the opportunity to introduce fellow cohort members to a new community that they might not have worked with in the past. It could be, you know, some prior experience that you've had that you want to bring to that cohort experience. But, you know, that being said, there's not necessarily like a requirement that you kind of have some sort of particular like resource or knowledge base that you're bringing to that training. The key thing that we want to see there is that, you know, you're ready for that kind of training experience, that cohort experience, and that you'll kind of plan to be engaged when that time comes. A little bit of information about what the grant can pay for versus what it can't pay for. These are very much project-based grants, but, you know, the expenses should generally be able to cover anything that would be associated with collecting an oral history project. So if you are doing your interviews in person, it can pay for recording equipment. Given our kind of current situation with the pandemic, many of these oral history interviews have been taking place remotely, and the grant funding can pay for an upgraded Zoom platform. It can cover, you know, some of the other virtual interviewing platforms that people have used, like Zencaster or Their Story. It can pay for transcription. Transcription is a requirement of the grant, and it's definitely a key expense that I, you know, would definitely recommend that everybody kind of think about when they're building their budgets for this grant. The funding can pay for translation. And again, there's also that opportunity to apply for an enhancement to the grant to cover translation of transcripts. It can pay for space rental if at the end of the grant program you intend to do a shareback session with the community. It can pay for honoraria. A lot of project directors will pay kind of nominal honoraria to their narrators. That's becoming more and more of an acceptable practice in oral history. So it's definitely possible to do that. But of course, you can also pay wages or stipends to your team members or yourself for your time that you're working on the project. Transportation, any publicity that you do to recruit narrators or to spread the word in a community about your project. The main things that cannot be funded are the more kind of administrative or overhead expenses for your organization, like general office supplies. rent. The grant cannot, unfortunately, cover food or drink. And then in most cases, interpretive works like films, books, exhibits, I should say, for this particular grant, interpretive works like films, books, and exhibits would not apply to the new projects grant, specifically because there is that public programs and events grant that does cover those kinds of things. These are some of the kind of primary requirements for the grant. Again, I would recommend that everybody view the request for proposals for a full list of the requirements and further description on all the requirements and the eligibility, everything you need to be eligible for the grant as well. But the application is open to organizations based in DC, individuals residing in DC, or again, if you are an organization that's not a 501c3 nonprofit, or if you don't have a permanent Washington, DC address, your grant can be sponsored by a fiscal sponsor that does meet those eligibility requirements.
I got a quick question. Is it okay now?
Sure, absolutely. Go ahead, Tony.
Say you formed a brand new nonprofit, right? And have not really kind of done anything yet, but 501c3 exists, all the legal requirements, there's a bank account, etc. But there isn't any financial audits and stuff. I know that's a part of the grant application portal. Could a brand new nonprofit apply for this?
So we do not ask you to, provide any audited financials or anything like that for this application. As long as, you have an EIN number and we can kind of look you up on GuideStar and see that, you don't have any exclusions or anything like that, then your 501c3 would work fine. Yep.
Thank you.
Lynn, did you have another question before I move on?
No, I must not have taken my hand down. Sorry.
No worries.
I have a question.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
On the last slide, you talked about the project dollars can be used for restoration. Does that include trying to restore pictures and different type of things that we may want to send off to companies to make copies of pictures and stuff?
It does for this grant. Yeah, for this grant, really, it's for the new projects and the extension grants, really the, only expenses are those ones that are directly related to collecting the oral histories. The exception to that is that, if you're planning on doing a small community share back program at the end, you could pay for event space or some nominal expenses related to that. But, if you wanted to go for the public projects and events grant, or in a subsequent grant period, if you wanted to do the public projects and events grant and you were putting together an exhibit or something like that, and part of the work of putting together that exhibit or putting together that digital humanities project meant, having some restoration work done on documents or photographs, that would be the grant that would be able to cover those kind of things.
Okay, and I guess one more question too. I don't know if we're going to cover or talk about budget. Since we are in this COVID situation, I realized on the last budget we did, we only got one computer in order to try to do some of the stuff, but it seems like it will be helpful to have an additional computer or tablets that we can give to people to have during interviews. Is that something that we can get dinged on in the budget process if we have equipment such as to conduct these interviews?
Nope, not at all. And I think especially like you say, the more people are doing these oral history projects remotely, and you want to make sure that all of your narrators have equipment that's going to, be able to handle everything appropriately, and it's not going to have any lag, or it's not going to drop the signal and stuff like that. I think it definitely makes sense to, purchase the equipment that you need. I think that the budget narrative piece, and as part of the application, you'll submit a budget using the template provided by Humanities DC, and you'll also write a budget narrative. If in that budget narrative you really clearly explain why the purchase of several computers is necessary, I think that would be a perfectly acceptable expense and would make a lot of sense to the review panels. Right. So
you'll get the reporting, yeah?
I'm sorry?
I was just making sure you're going to get to reporting the stuff out, right? We need to, itemize each of the expenses for the grant.
We may not get to that on this on this call, but Yeah, I mean, like, I can just kind of say, really quickly, and I think that the reporting piece is outlined a little bit more clearly in the RFP, but for this grant, there is an interim budget report, and then there's a final report. There's not, excessive, I would say, reporting. I think that there's, we usually do one kind of formalized check-in midway through the grant period as well. It kind of comes along with that interim financial report. But then the final report, does require grantees to maintain a record of those expenses against the grant. You'd be asked to provide an itemized list of all expenditures against the grant that you receive, as well as documentation for each of those expenses. So that is an important consideration, I think, even at this stage, that people, kind of keep that in mind and think about that, because that can be a really time-consuming piece of the grant process. And it's good not to catch people off guard with that. So it definitely makes sense to talk about it now. Yeah, and then, in that last bullet point there, awardees will submit both an interim and a final report, and will participate in at least one phone check-in. So yeah, that was very timely. Didn't even notice that was the last bullet point. So those are kind of the basics of the new projects and the extension grant. Talk a little bit about the public projects and events. As I said before, it can be for any type of public humanities program that interprets existing oral histories. This is just a very small selection of potential types of projects that you might propose. But, ideally, people will be creative and they'll think of things that we have not thought of yet or that we haven't seen yet as well. So no need to limit specifically to this list. But people have in the past done lesson plans, curricula. They've done really great digital projects, including story maps. People have put together public programs, discussion type events as well. So there's a lot of good possibilities with the public projects and events grant. The application will require you to talk a little bit about that existing archive. What specific oral history are you going to use? Where can they be accessed? And that's just to make sure that, in part at least, to make sure that, if you're proposing that you're going to use a set of oral histories for a project, they have to be ones that, you're not going to get to the project period. You're going to find that there are a lot of restrictions on those oral histories, or that they might not be as usable as you hope they would be. So you should really do a lot of research on that archive, or that collection of oral histories that you want to use before you get to the application phase. And again, it's also perfectly acceptable for that collection of oral histories that you want to use to be a collection that you hold personally. So they can be oral histories that you've collected and that you hold as part of a personal archive. The grant is, again, not for the creation of new oral histories. So if you want to collect new oral histories, that would be the new projects grant. And again, the idea would be that after you've kind of built up this archive of oral histories through the new projects and extensions grant, you would then be able to apply for this public projects grant and bring those out of the archives in a public humanities project. And then projects must also allow for narrators' voices to be heard. So one of the things that will be asked on the application is, how those narrators' voices will come through in the public or in the interpretive work that you create. So the ideal projects, what we're kind of looking for here is, the opportunity for those oral histories to at least some degree, with interpretation, of course, but at least to some degree, kind of speak for themselves as well. Like, I think that what we're trying to avoid with this question is projects that are fully interpretive and talk about the oral histories without kind of allowing the public to hear the voices of those people that were actually interviewed. A couple more narrative requirements for this one. The proposed projects for the public projects and events grants must identify a project scholar, and that can be the same person as the project director. It does not necessarily have to be somebody with particular credentials. It doesn't have to be somebody with a PhD or with a extensive academic background in the subject matter area. It just has to be somebody who can provide kind of a depth of knowledge of the topic and has some context in that topic or that theme that they can lend to the project. And then you'll also be asked to kind of talk about how that project scholar will connect with the project and lend that expertise and knowledge. The project must also demonstrate community collaboration and engagement as much as possible. So if it is possible to reach back to the narrators who actually gave the oral histories from the collection that you're using. We just want to, see where possible how you're kind of collaborating with that community or that group of narrators who actually contributed those oral histories. That's something that is not always possible, but it's something that when possible, it's great to have that in the application as well. Must result in the creation of a final educational project that can be archived and of lasting benefit to researchers, students, and the public. So, a lot of it, what we're talking about is potentially doing lesson plans or documentary films, things that can kind of be preserved and be kind of persistently available to people who are interested in learning more about the topic. But, even if you're doing something like a temporary exhibit or a kind of virtual or public discussion or something like that, what we're looking for is something that kind of results from those more ephemeral type of interpretive events that can be kind of retained and made useful to people in the future. So examples that might be a booklet that goes along with the exhibit. It might be a recording of whatever discussion has taken place, just something that kind of results in a lasting educational project. And then again, you would describe the timeline for the project and any sort of outreach plans to make sure that as many people as possible could engage with what's created. Similarly to before, talk a little bit about what it can and cannot fund. I know we're kind of running short of time here, but again, it breaks down as a project grant. So again, a lot of what it cannot fund are those overhead expenses, refreshments, hospitality, general office supplies, but any sort of wages or salary contracts for people who are working specifically on the project. Any of those things can be funded with the grant. Definitely, again, go back to the full RFPs for a complete list of the requirements. But project directors for the public projects and events grant, they won't have to take part in a 3-session training, but there will be an initial kickoff ceremony at the beginning of the grant period for everybody to kind of meet each other and again, kind of come together as a cohort and kind of share experiences with one another. Organizations with more than 14 employees would have to respond to the accessibility section on the application. And for that, if anybody is part of an organization with more than 14 employees, you would basically have to outline your organization's ADA policy and how it applies to the project that you're doing with the grant. Humanities DC will require the scheduled check-ins with project directors over the course of the grant period. Again, that would be for the purpose of this grant, one check-in session that will be connected to the interim report halfway through the grant period. The project roles that must be identified for the public projects and events grant are the organizational sponsor, the project director, and the project scholar. And again, the project director and the project scholar, and in some cases, the organizational sponsor could all potentially be the same person. Again, I know we're running out of time, but I'll just quickly go through some of these questions for the application. Just some things to consider. Are you doing a project that's collecting new oral histories or using existing ones? Is your organization a 501c3 or will you need a fiscal sponsor? Will your project be covering new ground? Are you making sure that you're collecting oral histories? You're proposing collecting oral histories that don't already exist in DCPL's archive or in an archive elsewhere? Will your project be able to fit within the grant period, especially pertinent to those public projects and events grants, which can be a little bit larger in scope? Are residents of DC the primary audience for the project? And have you closed out all of your previous HDC grants? Quick few steps on how to access the application. Again, please do go to humanitiesdc.org/grant/DCOHC grant. I will put some links in the chat to make this a little easier for everybody, but review the relevant RFPs for the full requirements and eligibility criteria. When you're ready to begin, you go to this URL, grantapplication.wdchumanities.org, to actually log into our grants portal. You'll have to create a new profile if you've never applied for a Humanities DC grant before, but then once you're there, or once you complete that profile, you'll be taken to an applicant dashboard where you can click on apply and it'll take you to a list of all of the grants that Humanities DC has available right now. And again, it's really important that you read those grants carefully and make sure that you're applying for the one that you mean to apply for. A lot of them do have very similar sounding names, so you want to make sure that you're getting the one that you actually want. Just a quick look at what the login page looks like for the online grants portal. If you already have an account, or you feel like your organization already has an account, rather than creating a new account, please do just reach out to us if you don't have access to it or you don't have the credentials, and we'll make sure to get you connected. That's just a way to kind of keep us from creating duplicate organizational profiles in the system. Just a quick look at the application budget template. They're very broad categories, I would say, but the template is available within the application. So this is what you would download and you would fill out and you would upload back to the application. Some of the categories, just some of the examples of expenses that could fit within some of these categories. If you were paying honoraria to your narrators, of course, it would go in the honoraria category. But if you were paying salary to your team members, there's a category for salary, wages, and contracts. If you're paying for vendors who are doing transcription, or if you're paying for an enhanced Zoom subscription, things of that nature, there's the supplies, vendors, and subscriptions category. Of course, there's also postage and telephone, which isn't necessarily quite as useful now as it used to be, but can still be important in some cases. Publicity and promotion, if you're doing outreach for your public program, or if you're doing outreach for recruiting narrators for your oral history project. Evaluation is not required for this grant, but if you happen to have a third-party evaluator, if you have somebody assigned to evaluation, especially again for your public projects and events grant, there's a line in the budget for that as well. Along with the application budget, again, you will need to draft a budget narrative where you're breaking down how you're spending the funds in each of these categories. So just as a quick example, in salary and wages, if you have multiple people that you're paying out of the funds that you put into that category, you would want to break that down in the budget narrative so that the reviewers can see exactly how you're intending to spend the money within each one of those categories. The DCOHC grants, I know that some people have probably applied for Humanities DC grants in the past. I just also wanted to say that the grants do not require a cash or an in-kind match. And there are just a few things to recap here. I won't go through everything, but you'll have the opportunity to list the key personnel who are going to be working on each of these projects. It's important to have a rough timeline, even though I know in most cases people won't know exactly how their project is going to unfold. You want to be able to provide a rough timeline over the course of the grant period. An outreach strategy, whether it's to get people to participate in your public program or to participate in the oral history project in terms of narrator recruitment or a shareback session for your communities. If you're using a fiscal sponsor as opposed to applying through your own organization, you definitely want to include a letter of support from the project fiscal sponsor. A couple of successful application strategies, which is make sure you break down your items listed on the budget sheet in that budget narrative really clearly so that the reviewers are able to see exactly how you're spending in each of those categories. Try to anticipate and answer the questions that reviewers might have. And one good way to do that, again, is to ask somebody who has nothing to do with your project, read over your proposal so they can kind of point out to you if it seems like something is a little bit less clear, or if you're referring to things that might be kind of in your own head, but you might not have kind of put those down on paper yet. It's always helpful to have somebody who isn't kind of working in the same space look over your proposal to make sure that things are clear to them. If you're listing any partner organizations, do make sure you include any sort of acknowledgement letters in the supplemental materials that acknowledge those partnerships. Just go through quickly the terms should you receive the grant. If you receive the grant, you're agreeing to document all the expenditures and include those in the final report at the end of the grant period. The award is distributed 100% upfront. So it's not kind of a, multi-distribution, half now, half later grant. Everything, if you receive the grant, is awarded to you upfront. So you have access to those funds throughout the grant program. If there are major changes throughout the grant program, you just have to communicate those to Humanities DC. And as part of accepting the grants, you'll also sign off on Humanities DC's grant conditions. There are, as I said, other grants that are offered by Humanities DC. Definitely would recommend you take the opportunity to explore some of those opportunities. And I believe that more of the grants outside of DCOHC will be released later this month. I don't know why it's doing that, but if you have any questions, and I know we did not leave as much time or any time for questions as I kind of hoped that we would during this period, but between now and kind of the run up to the deadline, I am available by email or
When's the deadline again?
Talk by phone. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I forgot, when was the deadline again? January?
The deadline is January 28th.
28th, okay.
Yep. So, we can definitely schedule phone conversation, Zoom meeting, anything that's necessary to kind of guide you through the application process and, make sure that you have all the answers that you need. Please do feel free to reach out. And I think, what I can do is I had a few kind of links that I wanted to share with everybody in terms of being able to look at Dig DC, access to Brian Kraft's map so that you can kind of see some of the oral history work that's already been done in the city. And I think one thing I can do, if everybody is okay with it, is I can send some of those links out to the registration list. If that works for everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
please.
All right, so I will do that and I will follow up with that email. I know that we're kind of over time right now, but are there any really burning questions that anybody feels like they have to have clarification on before they can get started? Happy to answer a couple questions for a few minutes.
Now, one question is, how could we find out if our subject matter is already been in the DC, in Humanities DC, or in the library?
Yep. So the best way to do that would be to look at the Dig DC collection with the DC Public Library, and that's one of the links that I'll send you. It's a fully online catalog, and they've been since 2017 when the project started, collecting and archiving all the DC Oral History Collaboratives grant kind of produced materials. So that's a good place to start. There's also a DC Oral History Collaborative collection survey that was conducted in the first 2 years of the collaborative that includes oral histories from archives across the city. And that is also one of the links that I'll send you as well. That can be a really good resource, not only in terms of finding out what oral histories have already been done, but also to kind of think about, what some organizations you might want to partner with would be as well. There's been a lot of oral history work that's been done in DC, prior to the collaborative. So those are two good places to start. I would recommend just checking out some of the kind of larger institutional archival collections. Like I know that the Library of Congress and the National Archives and the DC History Center also have a lot of, holdings on DC history that could be helpful to kind of take a look through as well.
Hey, I just wanted to jump in with a specific question. I was told about this program by a friend who had previously done it, and the friend said in the application process that you needed letters of recommendation, but it doesn't really seem like you need a classic letter of recommendation. More that you're looking, if you do want to submit a letter sort of vouching for you, that it should be tied immediately to your project. Did I catch that correctly? Or can you explain, or just maybe go over quickly again, the letter of recommendation process, to what extent it's necessary, to what you're looking for or not looking for from that?
Absolutely, yeah, and I think you got it just right. If you are looking to partner with an organization or in some way collaborate with an organization, very helpful to have a letter from them, expressing their support for their project and articulating, how they're going to contribute to the project. But what we don't necessarily need are letters that just talk about kind of how great the organization is to work with, or that aren't necessarily kind of talking specifically about the work that's being done under this grant. So it's, not like a kind of classic letter of recommendation. It's more specifically tied to how that organization or how that individual is going to be working with the project.
Got it. So just in case you don't have that kind of letter, certainly having a letter would probably bolster your application, but it's not a mark against your application if you don't have something along those lines.
No,
Okay.
not at all. No. All right, and
I'm sorry,
yeah.
I have a quick question. This is
Hi
Lisa
there.
Kennedy. Yes, first of all, I don't know if I missed this. Is this a competitive grant? Like, in other words, there's only a limitation on like how many grants will go out with each category, and then also will each once you are awarded the grant, are you assigned like a coordinator or someone who will kind of walk you through a lot of the steps or do a check-in with you?
That's a very good questions. It is a competitive grant. In some cases, it can be really competitive. I would say that, just like a rough estimation is about 25% of the applicants, over the years have been funded, or 25% from year to year have been funded. So it's not terrible, but it is definitely a competitive grant. And in terms of kind of the, kind of follow-up aspect of it, once the project period starts, if you are awarded the grant, specifically talking about the new projects grant, it is very much a cohort experience. So there is that initial onboarding that includes that 3-session workshop, but then, I and some of my colleagues, oral historians that we work with through the DC Oral History Collaborative will actually provide ongoing mentorship, guidance, support for awarded applicants throughout the process. We try to make it so that, if there are any kind of questions that come up related to oral history as a field or a practice, that grantees can feel free to, ask me or again, my colleagues who work with me on this, those questions. So it is meant to be a very supported experience. Again, in part so that you don't necessarily have to be, somebody who's an expert oral historian to approach this funding and approach this project.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Are there any more questions? Okay, well, thank you all for attending and joining me for the info session tonight. Again, if you have any kind of questions that you think about as you go back to that RFP and you read through it, or certainly as you kind of log into the system and you are kind of working through some of the idiosyncrasies of the grants portal software and everything like that, please feel free to reach out, and we'll, I'll do whatever I can to, help you apply for the grant. All right, thanks everybody. Have a good night.
Thank you very much. This is so helpful.
Great.
Thank you, Jasper.
You're welcome.
Bye. Thank you. Happy New Year again.
Happy New Year. Yeah,
Good luck with the alley cats too. That sounds great.
definitely.